Imagine a world where the cure could kill you faster than the disease, where doctors believed that draining your blood, poisoning you with mercury, or forcing you to vomit until you collapsed was the very essence of healing. This was not the Dark Ages of Europe. This was America, the colonies of the New World, where survival was already a daily battle, and medicine could be just as terrifying as the illness itself. Welcome to the channel, the place where history's strangest, darkest, and most unbelievable stories come to life. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because today we're diving deep into one of the most unsettling corners of American history, the bizarre medical practices of colonial America. In this episode, you'll discover how desperate colonists placed their trust in bleeding bowls, poisonous concoctions, and folk remedies that ranged from shocking to absurd. You'll see how European superstition mixed with native knowledge, how religion shaped medicine, and how the fight against epidemics led to dangerous experiments that sometimes saved lives and sometimes ended them. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear is not just a tale of old remedies, but a chilling reminder of how fragile the line between healing and harm has always been. To understand why colonial medicine was so bizarre and often so dangerous, we first need to step into the world of the American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries. Life was brutal. Death lurked in every corner. Most families buried at least one child before they reached adulthood, and epidemics like smallpox, dysentery, and yellow fever swept through entire towns. The average colonist didn't expect to live past their 40s. Illness was not the exception. It was the constant backdrop of daily existence. In this harsh reality, professional doctors were rare. In many towns, there simply weren't any. Most colonists relied on healers, barber surgeons, midwives, or even neighbors with a handful of home remedies. Those who had studied medicine in Europe often brought with them the theories of the Old World. Theories rooted less in science and more in ancient philosophy, superstition, and guesswork. And yet, despite the lack of modern understanding, medicine was still a business. Wealthier colonists could pay for a physician who promised to balance their humors, while poorer settlers turned to herbal cures passed down through generations. Sometimes they even borrowed remedies from Native Americans, whose deep knowledge of plants often proved far more effective than the invasive practices of European-trained doctors. But here's the catch. In a society where disease could wipe out an entire family in days, people were willing to try anything, no matter how painful, bizarre, or outright dangerous. A cure, no matter how unlikely, was always better than no cure at all. This desperate mindset laid the foundation for a world of bloodletting, mercury potions, and animal-based rituals that today sound more like witchcraft than medicine. And at the heart of it all was one belief system, a medical theory so powerful that it shaped every diagnosis, every prescription, and every bizarre treatment in colonial America. At the center of colonial medicine was an ancient idea, one that came not from the New World, but from the old teachings of Greece and Rome. This was the theory of the four humors. According to this belief, the human body was ruled by four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these fluids were perfectly balanced, a person was healthy. But if one became excessive or deficient, illness would follow. A fever, too much blood, melancholy, too much black bile, laziness, or congestion. blamed the phlegm, anger, or stomach trouble. Yellow bile was twofold. It was a tidy theory, easy to understand, and it carried the authority of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. The problem? It was completely wrong. But for nearly 2,000 years, it shaped medicine across Europe and eventually the American colonies. Colonial doctors didn't search for bacteria or viruses or even environmental causes. They looked inward into the supposed rivers of humors flowing through the human body. And if something seemed out of balance, their job was to restore harmony, usually by forcing something out. That meant draining blood, purging the stomach, inducing vomiting, or sweating out the supposed toxins. It meant that illness wasn't just a fight against nature. It was a battle against your own body, one where doctors often did more harm than the disease itself. And for many colonists, these treatments were not only accepted, they were expected. Patients believed that the more dramatic the cure, the more likely it was to work. Pain was a sign of progress. Weakness after bleeding or vomiting wasn't a danger. It was proof that the bad humor had been expelled. This unwavering faith in humors gave rise to some of the most disturbing treatments in early America. And none was more infamous or more deadly than the practice of bloodletting. If there was one cure that defined medicine in colonial America, it was bloodletting. The idea was simple. If sickness came from an imbalance of humors, and blood was the most dominant humor of all, then draining it would restore health. To a colonial physician, the body was like a vessel overflowing with bad fluid. Cut it open, let it flow, and balance would return. At least, that was the hope. The tools of the trade were as brutal as the practice itself. Doctors carried lancets, sharp little knives used to slice open a vein, or they relied on fleams, folding blades that could cut deep with a single strike. In more refined cases, they used leeches, applied directly to the skin, each tiny creature sucking blood until it swelled like a black pearl ready to burst. For the patient, the experience was agonizing and often terrifying. Imagine being feverish, weak, and delirious, only to feel the sting of steel slicing into your arm, or the slow pull of a leech tightening against your flesh. The sight of blood spilling into a bowl was enough to make the strongest settler faint. But here's the darkest part. Doctors didn't stop at a few ounces. Some believed that pints of blood needed to be removed. A single session could leave a patient pale, dizzy, and unable to stand. Yet physicians saw this weakness as proof that the treatment was working. Stories survive of patients bled again and again until their bodies simply gave out. Fevers worsened, infections spread, and death came not from the disease, but from the cure. And yet, bloodletting remained one of the most trusted practices of its time. Even centuries later, it would be used on some of America's most famous figures, including George Washington, who, in 1799, was bled of nearly 5 pints of blood in less than 24 hours during his final illness. He never recovered. In colonial America, though, this was seen as science. To refuse bloodletting was to refuse medicine itself. And for many settlers, there was little choice. A fever was dangerous. A wound could turn fatal. If bloodletting offered even the slightest chance of survival, it was worth the risk. But if bloodletting was horrifying, it was only the beginning. For when bleeding failed, colonial doctors turned to another weapon in their medical arsenal, a substance so toxic that it destroyed minds and bodies alike. Yet, in the 1700s, it was hailed as a miracle cure. That weapon was mercury. If bloodletting weakened the body, mercury destroyed it from within. Yet for colonial doctors, this shimmering, silvery liquid was nothing short of a medical miracle. Mercury had been used in Europe for centuries, prized for its supposed ability to purge the body of disease. By the time it reached the New World, it was the go-to treatment for one of the most feared afflictions of the age, syphilis. Doctors believed that rubbing mercury ointment into the skin, swallowing mercury-laced pills, or inhaling mercury vapor could drive out the infection. The logic was chilling. If mercury made the patient violently sick, if it caused vomiting, sweating, drooling, or diarrhea, then it must be working. The suffering was not a side effect, it was the cure. But the truth was far darker. Mercury is a deadly neurotoxin. Prolonged exposure slowly poisons the body, attacking the nervous system, corroding the mouth and gums, and causing tremors, delirium, and madness. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Skin would peel. The mind itself would unravel. Yet in colonial America, these terrifying symptoms were seen as evidence that the treatment was effective. Patients were told that salivation, the constant, uncontrollable drooling caused by mercury poisoning, was a sign of recovery. In reality, it was proof of irreversible damage. Mercury was not limited to venereal disease. It found its way into powders, ointments, and pills prescribed for a wide range of ailments, constipation, fevers, and even teething pain in infants. In some cases, patients survived, not because of the mercury, but in spite of it. In others, the cure was far worse than the disease, and perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. This dangerous practice endured for centuries. Even into the 19th century, American doctors continued prescribing mercury-based medicines, long after its destructive effects were widely observed. For the colonists, though, mercury was just another tool in the fight against disease. If bloodletting didn't drain away the sickness, and mercury didn't purge it from the body, doctors had still more brutal methods waiting in their arsenal. The next stage of treatment was not about poison or steel, but about forcing the body to turn against itself through purging, vomiting, and sweating. When bloodletting and mercury failed, colonial doctors reached for another set of brutal tools, methods that forced the body to cleanse itself from the inside out. To them, illness meant that something toxic was trapped within. And if it couldn't be cut out or poisoned away, it had to be purged. Purging usually began with powerful laxatives. Substances like senna leaves, rhubarb root, and sometimes more dangerous chemicals were given to patients to flush their bowels. The process was violent and exhausting, leaving patients doubled over in pain, dehydrated, and weak. Yet physicians insisted that every cramp and spasm was the sickness leaving the body. If purging wasn't enough, there was vomiting. Colonial doctors often prescribed emetics, concoctions designed to induce relentless nausea and expel whatever the patient had swallowed. Sometimes this meant drinking herbal brews so bitter they made people retch. Other times, more extreme measures were taken, mixing substances like antimony or even copper salts, which were toxic in themselves, but guaranteed to bring everything back up. And then came sweating. Colonists were encouraged to wrap themselves in blankets beside roaring fires or sit in makeshift sweat lodges, designed to boil out the bad humors. Patients with fevers already burning hot were forced to sweat even more, sometimes to the point of collapse. The more sweat that poured from the body, the more convinced doctors were that healing was at hand. These methods were not fringe experiments. They were the mainstream treatments of the day. Physicians recorded their successes in journals, and patients passed on stories of miraculous cures. But for every recovery, countless others suffered severe dehydration, organ damage, or even death. Still, the colonists clung to the belief that suffering meant healing. Enduring purges, vomiting fits, and sweat-soaked fevers wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. The pain was proof that the treatment was working, even when it was killing the patient. But some cures went even further, crossing from dangerous science into outright superstition. When the standard methods failed, doctors and healers turned to remedies that sound more like magic charms than medicine. Remedies that involved animals, strange rituals, and desperate hope. Not every colonist could afford a trained physician, and in truth, not everyone wanted one. When bleeding, mercury, and purging left families with more graves than recoveries, many turned to folk remedies. These cures were passed down through generations, whispered from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, blending European superstition with Native American herbal wisdom. Some were harmless, a poultice of herbs to soothe a rash, a tea of willow bark to ease pain, remedies that, in hindsight, actually contained ingredients we recognize today, like salicylic acid, the basis for aspirin, but others were downright bizarre. For fevers, one common remedy involved pressing a live puppy against the patient's bare chest. The heat of the animal, it was believed, could draw the sickness away. For tuberculosis, colonists swallowed snail water or mixed worms into milk, convinced that the creature's slimy or wriggling nature could counteract the disease inside them. Bruises or swollen joints, rub them with hogs, lard, or the fat of freshly slaughtered animals. Toothaches, place the ashes of a burned mouse on the aching tooth. Nosebleeds, stick a piece of dried toad inside the nostril. Even stranger, some cures leaned into sympathetic magic, the idea that effects like a patient with jaundice, for instance, might be given yellow-colored foods or drinks, as if the color itself held curative power. These remedies may sound laughable today, but in a time when death was always at the door, they carried real weight. For many colonists, folk medicine wasn't just cheaper, it was personal, rooted in family, tradition, and a belief that nature itself held healing powers, and occasionally it worked, not because of magic, but because plants, like foxglove, willow, and tobacco, contained active compounds. Folk healers didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the results. Yet, for every herbal success, there were countless rituals and concoctions that did nothing or made things worse. The line between healer and charlatan blurred, and desperation often silenced doubt. Still, as strange as these cures seem, they pale in comparison to what colonists attempted when faced with the deadliest disease of all, smallpox. And their response would lead to one of the most dangerous, controversial, and groundbreaking medical practices in colonial America, variolation. Of all the terrors that stalked colonial America, none was more feared than smallpox. It was a merciless killer, striking without warning, spreading like wildfire through towns and villages. Victims were first seized by fever and chills, then by the eruption of pus-filled sores that disfigured the face and body. Death rates could soar as high as 30%. Survivors were often left scarred for life, a permanent reminder of the disease's cruelty. Colonists knew smallpox as a curse, that could wipe out entire families in a matter of weeks. Outbreaks shut down trade, emptied churches, and sent waves of panic across the land. To many, it felt like divine punishment. To others, it was simply an unstoppable force of nature. But in the early 18th century, whispers of a dangerous new practice reached the colonies, a technique known as variolation. The idea was radical and terrifying, deliberately infecting a healthy person with smallpox. Physicians would take pus or scabs from a sick patient and insert it into a small cut on the skin, or sometimes blow powdered scabs into the nose. The goal was to provoke a milder form of the disease, one that would grant lifelong immunity. The risks were immense. Some patients did experience only a light case and survived with newfound protection. But others fell violently ill, spreading the infection to their families and communities, or dying from the very disease they had sought to avoid. In 1721, a smallpox epidemic swept through Boston. At the time, the Puritan minister, Cotton Mather, had heard of variolation from an African man enslaved in his household, named Onesimus described how, in his homeland, people were deliberately exposed to smallpox in a controlled way, and that those who survived were safe from future outbreaks. Mather, desperate to save his congregation, championed the practice. But when he and physician Zabdiel Boylston began experimenting with variolation, the city erupted in controversy. Religious leaders denounced it as tampering with God's will. Citizens accused Mather of spreading the plague rather than preventing it. An angry mob even hurled a grenade through his window. And yet, the results spoke for themselves. Out of nearly 300 patients Boylston inoculated, only 6 died, a fatality rate of about 2%, compared to the 14% death rate among those who contracted the disease naturally during the epidemic. It was far from safe, and it would take decades before vaccination, a safer alternative using cowpox, developed by Edward Jenner, replaced variolation. But in colonial America, this terrifying gamble marked a turning point. For the first time, doctors were not just reacting to disease, but actively trying to prevent it. Still, variolation remained deeply divisive. For every family that saw it as salvation, another saw it as a reckless invitation to death, and the debate between faith, fear, and science would only deepen as the colonies moved toward revolution and beyond. Yet variolation revealed something important. Not all medicine in the colonies was rooted in bloodletting and superstition. There were other traditions at play, traditions that offered hope, healing, and sometimes a gentler path to health. These came not from Europe, but from the people who had lived on the continent for thousands of years before the colonists arrived. The Native Americans. Long before European settlers stepped ashore, the native peoples of North America had developed their own sophisticated medical systems. Their cures were not guided by humors or bloodletting, but by a deep knowledge of the natural world, the forests, the rivers, the plants, and the animals that surrounded them. Native healers relied on herbal remedies, sweat lodges, and spiritual practices. Willow bark tea for pain and fever, echinacea for infections, tobacco for rituals of healing and purification, cedar smoke to cleanse the air. To the colonists, some of these remedies seemed alien, even pagan. Yet, in many cases, they worked far better than the bleeding bowls and mercury cures brought from Europe. What set native medicine apart was its holistic vision. Illness was not just a physical condition. It was spiritual, emotional, and communal. Healing often involved ceremonies, prayers, and rituals that restored balance not only to the body, but to the soul and the community. At first, colonists dismissed native practices as superstition. But desperation has a way of humbling even the proudest. As fevers, infections, and epidemics ravaged their towns, many settlers quietly turned to native remedies. Herbal poultices were used on wounds, teas brewed to break fevers, and sweat lodges adopted to drive out chills. Some of these adoptions saved lives. Others became twisted through misunderstanding, stripped of their original context, and blended into European folk medicine. Over time, a strange hybrid emerged. Colonial medicine that was part humoral theory, part old-world superstition, and part native herbal wisdom. But even with these influences, colonial medicine remained a dangerous gamble. To be sick in the 17th or 18th century was to place your life in the hands of treatments that could either heal you, harm you, or hasten your death. And yet, out of this strange mixture of bloodletting, poison, superstition, and borrowed knowledge came the foundation of American medicine. It was a painful, costly evolution, one that scarred countless lives, but also pushed the colonies slowly, stumblingly, toward progress. Looking back at the medical world of colonial America feels like peering into another universe, a place where the line between healer and executioner was frighteningly thin. Bloodletting, mercury, and blistering, cupping, charms, and prayers, variolation, a gamble with death. These practices were born from a desperate struggle against illness in a time when knowledge was scarce and fear was constant. And though many of them now seem barbaric, they reveal a truth about the human condition, our endless drive to survive, even if survival comes at a terrible cost. Not all the legacies were grim. The early adoption of variolation paved the way for vaccination, one of the greatest triumphs in medical history. The blending of native remedies with European traditions laid the foundation for a uniquely American approach to healing, one rooted in both science and nature. The heated debates over faith, superstition, and reason set the stage for the Enlightenment ideas that shaped a new nation. But the darker lessons cannot be ignored. Colonial medicine reminds us how fragile life once was, how easily desperation could lead to cruelty in the name of cure, and how progress often comes through pain. It also forces us to ask, what practices of today, hailed as modern and scientific, will future generations look back on with the same sense of horror and disbelief? As America grew, medicine grew with it. Hospitals, medical schools, and scientific societies would rise, replacing folk remedies with anatomy textbooks and microscopes. Yet the ghosts of colonial medicine linger in the cautionary tales of quacks, in the scarred pages of early medical journals, and in the stories of those who gambled everything in the fight. Colonial medicine was harsh, strange, and often deadly, but without it, there would be no modern American medicine. It was the painful crucible through which science slowly pushed aside superstition, and it reminds us, even today, that the path to healing is never straight. It is written in trial, in error, and in the courage to keep searching for a cure. History is not just about kings, battles, and revolutions. It is about the blood, the pain, and the choices of ordinary people, choices that shaped the world we live in today. If this journey through the bizarre world of colonial medicine opened your eyes, imagine what other secrets the past still holds. We dive into wild stories that textbooks forget, forgotten epidemics, quirky cures, lost civilizations, and game-changing discoveries. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who loves history's strangest and most shocking tales. Because the past is not dead. It lives on in us. And sometimes, the most bizarre chapters are the ones that teach us the most.